Welcome a very distinguished guest back to Fletcher. We're very excited. Now, you may know Dr. Karen Donfried as a former senior director of the National Security Council for Europe, or as the president, and she's now in the Euro Marshall Fund. But in fact, she is most famous for being a Fletcher alum. Because here, where she did her PhD not too long ago. So I'm very excited to welcome her back to Fletcher for a conversation on the transatlantic relationship of the U.S. and Europe. So she's going to talk for a bit and then take your questions. After that, we're looking forward to the discussion. So Karen, welcome.
Super. Thanks so much, Chris. It is really great to be here. And I did both a MALD here, and only a Fletcher alum would have something like MALD roll off their tongue. And I also did a PhD here. And I flew in from Washington this morning and had some travel snafu, so I'm fresh off of the plane, and I apologize for being a little bit late. But I also wanted to say that I had the great pleasure of calling Chris a colleague because he spent a year at something called the Transatlantic Academy at the German Marshall Fund. And so it's really wonderful. It was great to see Chris land at Fletcher, and I think you all are so lucky to have him here. So I run something called the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which is a very complicated name because you start up thinking it's German and end up hearing of the United States, but it captures the history of the organization. So we were created by a generous gift from the then West German government in 1972 to say thank you to us Americans for Marshall Plan assistance. So all of that is captured in that somewhat ungainly name. And I will say that I think there's nothing in the history of GMF that's been like the past 2 years, because our mission is strengthening transatlantic cooperation in the spirit of the Marshall Plan. And both parts of that have become contentious. The strengthening transatlantic relations, there are a lot of people, starting with our president, who question whether that's in the U.S. interest. And the other part about in the spirit of the Marshall Plan, in the spirit of those values that undergird the order that the U.S. worked so hard to build after World War II with our European allies and others. So these values of liberal democracy, free market economy, rule of law, rights of the individual. And we see lots of questioning of those underlying values in the U.S., but also across Europe. And so what I wanted to do today in talking about transatlantic turbulence is really think about what are the components of that. And I think there are both cyclical components and structural elements to the turmoil we see right now in the relationship between the United States and Europe. And I was actually, as I was writing these remarks, I was thinking about the Bob Dylan song, The Times They Are Changing. And in there's a line also about the order is rapidly fading. And, again, sort of trying to capture both those elements of the relationship. So in terms of the cyclical change, lots of elements of cyclical change, but the one I'm going to focus on is we know that the cycle turns every 4 or 8 years in the United States. So you have a new U.S. president who brings different perspectives, different policies into office. And there's no question that Donald Trump in his presidency has brought with him a very different view about the role of the United States, an America First policy that he defines in a very particular way, and he has brought into office a particular view of our European allies. And I think it's clear that when the president talks about an America First policy, he wants to be clear that U.S. national security will no longer be undermined by what he sees as bad deals. And he's reassessing our alliances and our trade agreements, and if he doesn't think they're supporting American interests, then we should renegotiate them or just scrap them altogether. And one of his core beliefs, I think has been clear over the past 2 years, is that he thinks the United States has gotten a raw deal from our allies. I think these are deeply held views on his parts, and we've all seen the tweets about the enormous bill that Europe owes the United States on the defense side. He's particularly critical of Germany's massive trade surplus. So for President Trump, alliances are not something enduring, they're something transactional. And that is quite distinct from the perspective over the past 70 years of US presidents. Now, when you look at the particular list of grievances that President Trump has with our European allies, they fall into several categories. Clearly, he has a concern about the trade relationship with Europe. And there's a deep sense of grievance about how our European allies have treated us on the trade front. There are many quotes we could point to, but one of, I think, the most striking is when the president said, the European Union was set up to take advantage of the United States, to attack our piggy bank. The EU is possibly as bad as China, just smaller. It's terrible what they do to us. Look at the car situation. And that's a big concern Europeans have right now, is that the US may slap tariffs on European cars. What we have done to date is the Trump administration has imposed tariffs, as you all will know, on steel and aluminum, and they did that by invoking a national security exemption. In response, the European Union is suing the United States over those steel and aluminum tariffs, saying that the US use of Section 232, which is what allows tariffs to be put in place on national security grounds, is illegal. And I think what was particularly upsetting to our European allies was that the administration would claim on national security grounds they had to impose their tariffs. So these are our closest allies where we're saying this is a national security threat to the US. On defense, we've gone from President Trump in the campaign saying that NATO is obsolete to President Trump actually reaffirming the US commitment to Article 5, that core part of the North Atlantic Treaty, when he went to Warsaw in July of 2017. And I think that the defense area, specifically NATO, is a place where there continues to be a really important distinction between some of the things the president has said and the actions of the administration. Because certainly the US has expanded its support for the European Deterrence Initiative, and we've seen NATO bolster its enhanced forward presence in the Baltics, in Poland, in the Black Sea region, and of course the US has troops on a rotational basis in Poland. So I think our actions on that front have actually been quite different from some of the things the president has said. Now I will say we were doing, GMF and a couple other organizations were doing a side event on the margins of the NATO summit last July, and that was deeply contentious because the president still is beating the drum very loudly on his upset that all NATO allies are not spending 2% of their GDP on defense. And the president basically threatened to pull the US out of NATO if those allies did not immediately correct that. And it was on that basis that an extraordinary session of the North Atlantic Council was convened to deal with that issue and try to restore at least a modicum of harmony to the alliance before all of those heads of state and government departed. Climate, another contentious issue. We all know that President Trump has pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement. In the president's eyes, this was another bad deal for the United States. We saw our European allies plead with President Trump to not withdraw the US. Their argument was this is a non-binding treaty, so please, for political reasons, we'd like you to stay in. Obviously, that's not what's happened. We now see a consortium of American states and cities continuing to pledge their commitment to the targets in that Paris Climate Agreement. On the foreign policy front, there are lots of things we could point to, but arguably the most contentious was the president's decision to pull the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which is something the Europeans had very proudly negotiated with the U.S. and of course also with China and Russia and Iran to limit Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. The IAEA continues to say that Iran is complying with that agreement. But President Trump did not feel that that was a deal that was in the interest of the U.S. We have seen the European allies stay in the deal, and we also recently saw them create a special purpose vehicle to try to facilitate some trade still with Iran that is allowed under that agreement. Now, you could look at all of this and say, is this really anything new? And if we look back at the past 70 years of the transatlantic relationship, Americans and Europeans have always had differences over policy. And some of those differences of policy have been fundamental, like over issues of war and peace. I remember very vividly the difference over the Iraq War. I actually served in the State Department at that time, and President Bush was not on speaking terms with his German and French counterparts. We just see the likelihood that the INF treaty is going to go poof. And I remember huge demonstrations in Germany over the issue of the deployment of intermediate nuclear forces in Europe. Or you can go back to the Suez crisis. So, I mean, there's a long, rich history of policy disagreements between the US and Europe. Is this any different? I think, actually, this moment is fundamentally different because the differences are not only about those policies I just rattled off, they're also about what kind of international order do we support. It goes back to this idea of the liberal international order, to use the policy wonky term. And that brings me to this question about structural change. So clearly there's been cyclical change. I would argue that we're also seeing profound structural change. So, both of these arguments go to the point that Donald Trump is a symptom of much deeper trends. He is not the cause of them. And if we think about structural changes, there are various things we could point to, but I want to focus on the global power shift that is happening before our eyes. The first element I'm sure that all of you would point to is the rise of China, and that's absolutely right. I mean, we have seen over ensuing decades China play an increasingly important role in the international system. For quite a while, it was really a quiet rise, and of course the rise of China has become much noisier in recent years, whether that's in the South China Sea, whether it's Huawei and a 5G network that is spreading globally. So there are lots of reasons why China is something now everybody's focused on, including Europeans. Now, the second element of that structural change, and related to the rise of China, is what I would call the relative decline of US power. Now, surely that is a relative decline that we also have been watching over decades. And my argument there is, you think about power in the international system, and if there's one power that's rising, well, that is going to impact the country that had been the lead nation, the United States. What strikes me about the implications of this for the US today and why this moment is different is that the United States, I would argue really for the first time in 70 years, is no longer a status quo power. So the United States is the one lashing out at this rules-based order that we created. So you have this phenomenon where the lead nation in the system arguably has gone rogue. And this is another element that has been deeply disconcerting to our European allies, because they feel that their interests and their values have been well served by that overarching liberal international order, by that rules-based system. And they're deeply unnerved by a US president who doesn't share that belief anymore. And of course that gets me to Europe, and that's the third part of the structural change I'll focus on. There are of course many other elements. What's striking to me about Europe in 2019 is Europe's divisions. And we talk about the European Union, but you could really talk about the European disunion right now. And there are many elements of that. I mean, there are serious forces pulling the European Union apart today. You can start with the Eurozone crisis, which really hasn't been resolved. It's been managed, but the imbalances among those 19 members of the Eurozone remain stark. And the focus isn't so much on Greece today, it's on Italy and Italian banks. There's an assertive Russia on Europe's eastern border. And that became very apparent to us in 2014 when Russia legally annexed the sovereign territory of its weaker neighbor, Ukraine, and we're still dealing with the fallout of that, first and foremost, in terms of the ongoing violence in Ukraine's east. The refugee and migration crisis, which hit a high point surely in 2015, but the repercussions of that are felt in every European country and continue to roil politics. Challenge of domestic terrorism. Brexit. I mean, the news every day seems to be the latest shoe to drop on the Brexit issue. But, you know, for the second largest economy in the European Union, for a majority of British citizens to decide on balance they would rather leave the European Union is stunning. And we're now a month away from March 29, when the 2-year clock on Article 50 stops. And we know a little bit more because Prime Minister May has now said, if you don't support my deal, then I will ask for an extension of that timeline. But it's really quite stunning how unsure we are about how Brexit plays out. And then the challenge of authoritarian populism. It's not just Viktor Orban we're talking about today. It's we see either authoritarian populist leaders in key member states of the European Union and also parties. So whether it's Salvini of the League being deputy prime minister in Italy, or Germany for the first time in its post-war history having a far-right party in parliament, the AfD, to the Sweden Democrats in Sweden. It's really stunning to see the rise of authoritarian populism across Europe. So, you know, you see those divisions, and the traditional role of the US would actually be to try to help Europe overcome those divisions. Because the US after World War II made the decision that we supported European integration because we thought that was the only way to ensure these countries don't go to war again. Well, today, Donald Trump supports Brexit. Donald Trump thinks that why would anyone want to join a European Union? Because you're giving up national sovereignty. So this idea of pooling sovereignty, that by giving up sovereignty over some issue areas because it makes you stronger, that negotiating a trade agreement as a European Union will give you more clout than if you're negotiating as Britain or as Luxembourg. That is not a concept that makes sense to Donald Trump. So we've become an agent furthering Europe's divisions. And it's fascinating to me the different reactions to this across Europe. Because you can't talk about a European response to the Trump administration. I mean, if you go to Paris, what you hear there is French saying, we need to double down on strategic autonomy. Because America's not that. And we can't rely on that country. We may be dependent on the US today for our security and defense needs, but we have to spend more and we have to become more independent. Okay, then you go to Berlin. And there are some Germans who actually find that thinking very attractive. But I would say the balance of opinion in Germany is this is a singular US president. This is more about cyclical change. We need to exercise strategic patience. Then you go to Warsaw, and the Poles are like, Karen, what are you talking about? Strategic autonomy or strategic patience? We are all about strategic embrace. I mean, we've got this big bad neighbor called Russia, and we're not convinced the French and the Germans are going to defend us. So we want America. And that's, of course, why the Polish president, Duda, went to the White House, reiterated an offer of $2 billion for a permanent US base in Poland, and he went so far as to offer to call it Fort Trump. So the reaction to current US policy is very different depending on where you are in Europe. And I do think we are a force that is exacerbating these divisions. So, having said all that, can I be at all optimistic about the transatlantic relationship? Things don't look that great right now. So, I think that we need to be focused not on sort of returning at some point to a status quo ante, sort of a pre-Trump transatlantic relationship. I think we really need to be focusing on a new relationship and arguably sort of a new West. And I say that for a bunch of reasons. I mean, first, just let me say the reason I don't think we give up on the transatlantic relationship is facts are stubborn things. I actually don't believe in fake news. I do think there are things called facts and there are truths and untruths. And if you look at the facts, the fundamentals are compelling of the U.S. relationship with Europe. If you're looking at the economic indicators, the EU and the U.S. are the world's largest trade and investment relationship. So our economic health is very much intertwined with the success of Europe. And I mean, I can cite the statistics, I won't do that. But if you look at global merchandise trade, if you look at investment flows, if you look at jobs, it is just stunning. On the defense side, our most important alliance today continues to be NATO. And let's remember that the only time Article 5, the collective defense principle of NATO, has ever been invoked was after the attacks of 9/11, when our European allies said, we are going to come to the defense of the United States, which was not at all what we thought would be the case when NATO was created in 1949. And so I think that the defense piece is important, and I would also remind us that every European ally and Canada have been with us in Afghanistan since we went to war there. So going on 18 years, they have been with us on the ground in Afghanistan. And I don't think we reflect enough on what those military ties mean for us. And I do think values still matter. And I think that we as a country are based on a profoundly important set of values that we share with Europe. And this becomes particularly important when we think about the challenge of a liberal democracy. I think that term, I remember when Viktor Orban first used it, and I was so taken aback by it because, in my mind, the United States is based on this idea of liberal democracy, which means it's not just about majoritarian rule, but we also believe in defending the rights of minorities. I mean, there's so many elements of liberal democracy that we don't even think about until they're challenged. And I do think that the vast majority of Americans, the vast majority of Europeans continue to hold those values dear. So I think the fundamentals are compelling. I think the global power shift is real. So, we saw a national security strategy put out by the Trump administration that talked about the return of great power competition, focused on the challenges posed by China and Russia. And when I say that I think there's been a relative decline in U.S. power, I say that quite consciously. I don't think it's an absolute decline. I think it's a relative decline. But what that decline means, in my mind, is that the U.S., in meeting the challenges out in this world, will be most effective if we can bandwagon with our allies. So the U.S., rather than trying to meet the challenge of rising China on its own, will be better served with allies around it. And whatever you think of President Obama's policies, certainly that was the thinking behind TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. The idea was that with your Asian and European allies, you try to extend a rules-based trading system and thereby encourage China to accede to it. I mean, that's never going back to that, but I think that logic of working with allies makes the U.S. stronger in an international context. So then the question is, okay, how helpful can Europe be to the U.S. in meeting those challenges? I think the question on Russia is, can the U.S. and Europe maintain their unity? Because I think what we saw after the illegal annexation of Crimea was the U.S. and the European Union working quite closely together. The U.S. was able to move out more quickly in a NATO context in terms of buttressing the defense on NATO's eastern border. We also moved out, the U.S. also moved out more quickly on imposing sanctions, but we did it in a coordinated manner with our European allies, and the EU has stuck to all of the sanctions that were put in place in the wake of the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the violence in Ukraine's east. And the interesting thing on Russia, or the confusing thing, is we seem to have at least three different Russia policies. We have President Trump's views, we have where his administration is, and we have Congress. And so I think that's a little confusing for our allies, because there's not necessarily unity of action and purpose among those three. But I am struck that if you look at the U.S. Congress, where we see such deep polarization, there are two issues where there's been a pretty strong bipartisan consensus. And those issues have been how to respond to Russia and also their support for NATO. It's really interesting to be at the Munich Security Conference a little over a week ago, where you had the largest ever congressional delegation to that Munich conference. 50 members of Congress, 5-0, a bipartisan delegation of members, basically coming to say, we care about Europe and we support NATO. You've seen a resolution pass the House of Representatives that is concerned about the president's threats to pull out of NATO. Basically, so they're saying, he should not be allowed to do that. We won't appropriate any money to allow him to do that. Passed by 357 votes to 22. So you see, I think, a strong bipartisan consensus, certainly in Congress, on Russia and on NATO. On China, I think the question is, can we create unity of action with our European allies? I think for a very long time, the US and Europe has viewed China in fundamentally different terms. For the Europeans, their relationship with China has been primarily an economic relationship. You know, for a country like Germany, China is a major export market. For the United States, we have a critically important economic relationship with China, no question, but we also have treaty allies in Asia. We have a very developed political and security relationship. So we've looked at China through different lenses. I think what we're seeing now is Europe developing a strategic view of China. And there are lots of reasons for that, but I think one important one is the narrative is no longer about Europe going east, it's about China coming west. And the Belt and Road Initiative basically means, China's coming to countries near you to invest strategically, buying up ports, and the Europeans are realizing the challenge this poses to them. And this really connects Americans and Europeans. And we've had concern about strategic investment for a long time, and our CFIUS process is a reflection of that. And now you see almost every European country and the EU trying to put in place procedures to test on whether a foreign investment could potentially pose a strategic threat to that country. You see it on intellectual property theft. There too, Americans and Europeans are very concerned. So there are lots of trade and investment issues where I think Europeans now realize they need to be much more wary of Chinese activity. So I think there's a possibility there that we haven't seen so much in the past. So where I conclude on this is, and this is really a mandate to all of you, because as you are here at Fletcher taking classes, thinking about these issues, I'd really sort of like to throw the gauntlet to you to think about what are the changes we need to have in some of our long-standing relationships. And I realize there are a mix of nationalities in this room, so this is for each of you, from whatever your national perspective is. But, for me as an American, I do think that the U.S. will play a different role in the international system than we did through the Cold War. And what I mean by that is whether you're, President Trump, where I think in America, first policy in many ways has led to an America alone policy. I think even if you have a different U.S. president who has a much more traditional view of alliances and allies, I think that the U.S. will be much less focused on providing things to Europe. I think we're going to be much more focused on Europe contributing to global economics, to global security. So, in a situation like Ukraine, I think future U.S. administrations would really like to see Europe take the lead on that, or Mali, and pick your issues around Europe's borders. And so I think it's critical that our European allies do more. not for us, but for them, to defend their own security interests. And I think that we together, Americans and Europeans, need to reflect on how we should reform the institutions that have been the pillars of this liberal international rules-based order. You know, how do you reform the WTO to work against issues like technology transfer or to protect more comprehensively intellectual property? So I think you can look at every institution that sort of undergirds this order and say, is it fit for purpose in the 21st century? And if not, what are the reforms that we should be thinking about today? Maybe there's not an opportunity to implement them today, but sort of to be poised for that next chapter of the U.S. role in the world. Let me stop with that. I really would love to have this be a conversation. And happy to talk about any of these ideas, but also happy to talk about whatever you all want to talk about. So I will pass the baton back over to all of you. And Chris, thank you
very much, Karen. Could I use my privilege as the moderator to ask the first question?
I think you get to do that. Yeah.
I was very interested in your comments about Europe's involvement in the new strategic move towards China. And I'd be interested to know whether that's more of a piece of policy advice to Europe or a prediction of what Europe will do. Because certainly you see some Europeans talking about China in less of a trade and more of a security sense, but I'd be interested to know whether you think that will be the European mainstream in 5 or 10 years, or whether it be a minority view of people whose job it is to think about China in that context.
So it's really interesting because I do think there's a disconnect today between public opinion and sort of elite or policymaker opinion. I recently saw a poll of public opinion in Germany, and it was a question about who do you trust most, Trump, Putin, or Xi? And our president came in last. And so I think there's a public view, actually across most European countries, where the public feels the Trump administration is trying to start a new Cold War with China. And they're very concerned about that. Now, we may find out very soon that that's not true, because the president seems to be close to making a deal with the Chinese on the trade front. But but I do think the public is very skeptical about U.S. policy toward China. But if you talk to policymakers, China experts across Europe, they absolutely see the challenge that China poses, and they have clear evidence of it as well. You know, just to take one example, Greece obviously was in a very difficult economic position after the 3 bailouts and the concern about would Greece actually have to leave the Eurozone. So Greece was desperate for foreign investment, and they were selling off various assets, one of which was the port of Piraeus, really big port in Greece. And they sold the port of Piraeus to China. And then, not that long thereafter, in June of 2017, there was a meeting of the UN Human Rights Council, and the European Union had authored a statement that was critical of China's human rights record, and Greece vetoed it. It was the first time ever that a member state had vetoed a human rights critique in the UN Human Rights Council. So that's one very clear example. And you see China really trying to divide the EU through this 16+1 format they have, where they convene with it's a mix of EU member states and Balkan countries. And so I think, you know, you've had multiple things happening where Europeans are like, huh, okay, maybe China isn't all good. Maybe it's not just a wonderful export market for us. So, you know, I think if you see governments putting in place policies that make clear to their citizens that it's not just the United States that is concerned about the challenge China poses, but that they too see risks with that engagement, I think you might see public opinion starting to change too. But I do think today there is still quite a significant disconnect between where the public is and where the policymakers are. Please, and please introduce yourselves.
My name is Daphne. I am a Kantian scholar. I'm from Armenia. And when you we're speaking about China, I just remember Professor Maschmeyer, who puts forward an idea of closer cooperation with Russia and Iran in order to deter China's influence on global affairs, especially on Eurasia and heartland. So what do you think about this idea? Cooperation with Russia and Iran vis-a-vis China?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there are a good number of people who are making that argument today. Like, you know, let's be clear. The big challenge the U.S. faces in the 21st century is China. It's not Russia. I mean, that I generally agree with. I think China is a rising power, and I think Russia is a declining power. But that said, you know, Russia's doing a lot of bad stuff. And I think if we do believe in certain values, we need to speak out about the bad stuff that Russia's doing. But also, you know, some of that stuff is happening in our own country. And I'll promote a program at GMF. I have a group of colleagues that started something called the Alliance for Securing Democracy. And basically it's looking at how do we build resilience in our democratic societies against foreign actors with nefarious purposes who are trying to undermine our democracies. And of course the thing we all think of first is Russia trying to interfere with our elections. I mean, Russia's doing that across Europe as well. We see the funding streams from Russia to Marine Le Pen and other far-right politicians in Europe. I mean, I think we have to care about that stuff. So, you know, I don't support saying the only thing that matters is China's rise and let's put everything else aside and therefore cooperate with Russia. I think we have to hold Russia accountable for things that it's doing, and I think that makes it quite difficult to then cooperate with Russia and China. And what we see Russia doing right now is actually trying to cooperate with China itself. I mean, Russia sort of sees that may yield more for Russia, and there's an energy relationship there that in a way benefits both countries. So I guess I agree with sort of at a high strategic level, yes, I understand the logic of that, but I think there are lots of other things that are happening in those relationships today that make that perhaps not a goal that I would say we should strive for right now. But your real Russia expert is here. So, so yeah, there's someone in the back, and then we'll come up. Who's the answer to this? Yeah.
I'm Amy Rosenfeld. I'm a second-year involved student focusing on public international law and power politics. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this Belt and Road kind of response or non-response that we're seeing both from the United States and from Europe. I know
Sorry, what was the what kind of response?
Or non-response that we're seeing for the Belt and Road, or to the Belt and Road from Europe and from the United States, and whether or not you think that's a critical piece of both Europe and the U.S.'s China policy moving forward.
Yeah, you know, Belt and Road, and I am not a China expert, so you know, I look at this from my transatlantic perspective, and you know, looking at how the Belt and Road is playing out globally, it's really quite striking to see countries like Bangladesh, like others say, this is not working out for us, because the incredible amount of indebtedness these countries face if the projects aren't successful is a big problem. So I'm wondering if the backlash we're going to see to Belt and Road comes from the countries that ostensibly thought they were going to benefit from what China was doing there. And it's interesting because you sometimes will hear comparisons between the Belt and Road Initiative and the Marshall Plan. But if you unpack them, which I've not done, I've read things others have written who've unpacked the Belt and Road Initiative, the indebtedness aspect, the loan aspect of it is so much larger than what you had in the Marshall Plan, sort of the balance between grants versus loans. And it's not at all clear to me that at the end of the day, Belt and Road is going to be something that actually allows China to aggrandize its power, but there may be a real backlash created in many of these countries. Now, Europe, it's a bit unclear, and we've seen, well, China and Russia actually have quite a bit of success in many East European countries. I mean, Hungary is a really good example. And if you look at the Trump administration, the Obama administration essentially was ostracizing Hungary on the values side. Secretary of State is not going to come and visit Hungary. The president is not going to welcome Viktor Orban in the Oval Office. The Trump administration had a different view. They thought that was wrong, and they thought that the U.S. could have greater impact on a country like Hungary if we engaged, and thereby encourage different behavior. I mean, we've now seen that policy for well over a year, and it's hard to make the case that's been successful, either in terms of Orban pursuing a different values course or Orban trimming back his ties to Russia and China. So, I mean, I think there's a question about how you work against that. And certainly the U.S. is not in a place where it's going to be doing a Marshall Plan for countries in any part of the world. So I don't know that there's going to be a direct response to it, but I do think awareness has been heightened to what China is trying to do, and that will influence both the readiness with which countries will accept some of these projects, but also I think they'll pay closer attention to places where maybe those initiatives haven't worked out the way the host country thought they would. Yeah, I'll come back to you in a sec, but there was someone, yeah, and then I'll come back there. Yeah.
So speaking of Russia, the Trump administration
Don't
has
tell me who
been...
you are.
I'm Ari.
Oh,
Trump administration has been very critical of the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and yet the Germans have agreed to it. It seems that the project is moving forward full speed, and it's divided Europeans as to the way it creates dependence on Russian energy in Europe. So what is your assessment of this, and how do we reconcile the divisions among European countries who support Nord Stream 2 and those who oppose it?
It's a great question, and I'm sure all of you read about the speech that Chancellor Merkel gave at the Munich Security Conference, or if you didn't, Chancellor Merkel is not known for being a good public speaker. She gave a speech like I have never seen her give at the Munich Security Conference. She was animated, she was compelling, she was even funny at times. And I won't go into analysis of why that was, but what she did is she basically took every contentious issue in the transatlantic relationship and talked you through her logic. Like, here's why I land here. And some of that was quite compelling. Like, she took on the trade issues and why Germany's so concerned about hard tariffs potentially being put in place. And so she talked about, beats me why a car that's made in South Carolina is more threatened to the U.S. because of course BMW's largest manufacturing plant is in the United States. So she was, some of those were quite close. Okay, that was pretty good. Okay. But on Nord Stream 2, there were a couple of areas where I thought, she just doesn't have a good argument. If you're critical of Nord Stream 2, and what are the criticisms? I mean, I don't know how many people here are tracking this, but Nord Stream 2 basically increases the flow of Russian gas to Germany and therefore to Europe. One criticism could be that the pipeline bypasses Ukraine, so Ukraine doesn't get the benefit of the transit fees. Another criticism could be you don't want to increase your reliance on Russian gas, because Russia isn't a dependable supplier. The Germans look at the U.S. and say, all you guys care about is selling LNG. You're not critical of Nord Stream 2 for any principled reason. I mean, let's be honest, the most co-op part of Ukraine is naphtha gas. So really, is it bad for Ukraine if they get less in transit fees? We, Germany, are willing to help Ukraine if they lose these transit fees. And her argument on greater dependence on Russian gas was, we had a deep relationship with Russia during the Cold War. And it was interdependence. I mean, they needed the Western currency and we needed the gas. What's to suggest that changes today? And then she had this line about a Russian molecule, it's a Russian molecule, however it transits Europe. But then, the place she ended on was, you know, Chester Beckle, I'm standing here between the Chinese representative and President Poroshenko. So this is a little uncomfortable for me to say this, but do we really want to drive Russia into the arms of China? And the problem with that argument, and this is I don't have a deep understanding of pipelines, but I know pipelines go in certain directions. So, you know, if you've got pipelines going west, you can't very easily have them go east. Now, there may be a long-term play there, but I just didn't think it was a very compelling argument. I thought she was trying to play the China card in a way that just didn't ring true on Nord Stream 2. And the thing that I found most striking about her Nord Stream 2 argument is her whole speech was basically an argument about why Germany believes in multilateralism. And that why, if you're a German chancellor, you will conclude that your interests are served best by pursuing multilateral policies, working through multilateral institutions. And I just thought, isn't that interesting when you think about Nord Stream 2? Because to your point, that is a deeply divisive issue within Europe. And there are a lot of other EU member states who disagree with German policy on this. And, you know, in that sense, I sometimes think that Germany is to Europe what the US is to Europe. That, you know, Germany is like the big country, largest economy in the EU, kind of has the weight of an elephant. And if it wants something, it will ignore the views of its neighbors. So this commitment to multilateralism is not always reflected in policies. And I actually think Nord Stream 2 is an interesting example of that. So, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Miriam. I'm a second-year MALD. First of all, thank you so much for all of your insights. In terms of the transatlantic relationship, there seems to be a near consensus within the U.S. policymaking circles that the EU member states of NATO don't pay their, or just NATO member states besides the U.S. do not pay their fair share, and they're at times riding on, you know, the U.S.'s coattails or whatever the term may be. How can, and I'm not sure if you agree, but I would want to change the narrative where it seems like there is actually almost equal burden sharing, because the U.S. uses, you know, NATO countries, naval ports, hospitals, air bases, all those things for their missions whenever they decide to meddle in the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, wherever it may be. But also the EU as a body and all those member states that happen to also be NATO member states, they give so much money to aid, say, in Ukraine, or like more than 10 times than the US does, and things like that. And also the 2% GDP marker doesn't distinguish between national and alliance purposes spending. So the US always does give more than 2%, but that also includes its spending for defense and, you know, protecting Japan. So how can we change that narrative?
Yeah, you know, it's also a great question, and I think you have a very sophisticated understanding of the issue. You know, what's my view? Yes, I mean, European countries should spend more on defense. I have no problem saying that. I think it's true. I think this is not a new U.S. position. I mean, basically, for the life of NATO, successive U.S. administrations have said, Europeans need to spend more on defense. So, you know, President Trump would say, well, damn straight. And I'm finally having an effect because all of my predecessors were just too nice. They asked them to pay more, but they didn't demand it. And I'm making them uncomfortable, and look at the numbers. They're actually doing more. Okay, so, I mean, is that strategy working? You know, my reading of this history is that it was actually before President Trump took office that NATO allies recommitted themselves to trying to achieve 2% of GDP spent on defense. Why? Because of Ukraine, right? It was at the Wales Summit in 2014 where NATO came together every member state said, oh, we kind of got that wrong. Like, we all sort of thought we weren't going to see war on the European continent again. We kind of thought that Russia had concluded that cooperating with us was more in its interest than engaging in open conflict, and we were wrong. So we better get serious about our ability to defend ourselves. So in my mind, it was the realization of a threat on Europe's eastern border that was what encouraged countries to spend more on defense. I mean, I think it's in everybody's interest in the alliance to have President Trump think that he is being successful in this policy pursuit, because it is such a sensitive issue for him. And I think the thing that's challenging about the issue is, let me give you an example. GMF had a dinner. We've been doing a lot more outreach to governors and mayors, just because I think it's also important for Europeans to have a holistic view of the United States, to really understand what's happening. And as it happened, we ended up with 3 Republican governors at this particular dinner. So there wasn't a Democrat in the group. And the governors were very well informed, and one of them put this issue on the table. It was a dinner with the European Diplomatic Corps. And one of the governors was like, well, you guys can't even pay 2% of your GDP on defense. And one of the European ambassadors there, who's from a country that does pay 2%, I won't tell you the country, but I'll imitate the accent and you'll know. Of course, we agree it's very important that we all spend 2% of our GDP on defense, and I would second that, of course. But, it might be that there's a nuance of the issue that you've not fully understood. And then he sort of gave the answer you just gave, or that I would give, like this highly nuanced answer. And the governor is like, lets him talk and says, well, all I can tell you is if you owe me $10 and you offer to pay me back $5, am I supposed to be happy with that? And I was sitting there thinking, there are so many things wrong with that. But it's brilliant in its simplicity. And this is the thing, like everybody gets, you're not paying your fair share, right? And they don't get that, well, there are lots of other factors that matter, which they do, right? And in my book, the holy grail of NATO has been alliance cohesion. And I feel like for Donald Trump, the holy grail of NATO is spending 2% of your GDP on defense. And my concern is that that focus, that singular focus on defense spending is undermining alliance cohesion. Because of course it doesn't only matter how much you spend, it matters what you spend it on. It depends on how much you're putting into research and development. And I mean, I wrote down the statistics. I thought my talk was too long, so I was clipping out some things. But if you look at 2017 numbers, so look at defense budgets of NATO members minus the US, okay? US out. Their defense budgets total about $300 billion. Who knows, other than Chris, what Russia's defense budget is? Russia's defense budget is $166 billion. I mean, so our NATO allies, if you take us out, spend markedly more on defense than Russia does. So that says to me, we should be caring not only about what they spend, but how they spend it. And are those forces ready? Do they have the right capabilities? So, yes, I think it is problematic to reduce this argument just to money, but politically, I see how compelling it is. So we got to get a bumper sticker that captures that more nuanced argument, simply. Yeah.
You spoke about the reform of the, Antje Danielson at MIT at the Energy Initiative. You spoke about reform of the institutions, and I'm curious to know if you think that there is an urgent timeline involved in this. So, I don't know, a date by which, if we don't reform, everything falls apart. And I would also be curious to know if you see certain areas of research that can help in this endeavor more than others?
Yeah. You know, I think probably it needs to be approached sort of institution by institution. If you look at something like the World Trade Organization, you know, the dispute resolution mechanism is basically ground to a halt because we don't have enough judges on it, and the administration is blocking any new judges. So that's a big problem. I mean, because if you don't have a dispute resolution mechanism in the WTO, it becomes an ineffective organization. So I think there are some institutions where, you know, if we want them to continue to play a useful role, that needs to be focused on immediately. Now, I think, or I fear, the Trump administration may be quite happy if the WTO ceases to function, which actually is a bit ironic because the U.S. has been well served by the WTO. But that's an organization I'm quite concerned about. So that might be at one end. And, you know, at the other end, NATO, interestingly, I think is an organization that actually has gone through quite a bit of adaptation over time. As the threat levels have changed, I remember when there used to be a debate about NATO out of area or out of action. Well, that's not even really talked about today, right? I mean, NATO's been in Afghanistan for 18 years. So I do think different institutions are different in terms of the level of adaptation and reform that's taken place over time and you know, how effective they are. But I think that, you know, today is the day to be thinking, I mean, we're not thinking about it already, to be looking at these institutions and saying, you know, how do we make sure they're fit for purpose? So that, you know, if you have, and the U.S. plays a critical role in all of these organizations in terms of breathing life into them and respecting the judgments that these organizations agree on or build a consensus around. So in my mind, it's sort of thinking about, I do think it probably waits to a new U.S. administration, but having a set of ideas and policy prescriptions that would be available to a new administration if they were so disposed to want to look at sort of the multilateral order and try to breathe new life into some of these organizations. And again, I mean, I think that because the United States is the big power in the system, we are well served by that multilateral order because we helped create those organizations. We, you know, the rules that they're enforcing are rules that serve our interests as the lead nation in the system. So, you know, I would hate for us to say, oh, multilateralism is dead, you know, let's just move on. No, let's think about how you could try to adjust some of these organizations to make them relevant again.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Hey, thank you so much for being here again, Stephanie. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the WTO and how it could be reformed to address some of the concerns you mentioned Europeans and Americans have with respect to trade with China.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a trade expert or a WTO expert, so it's, you know, it's sort of obvious things that I see. It's just a general observer. One of them clearly is the dispute resolution mechanism, and we actually had, as a fellow at GMF, she's not there anymore, but someone who used to be a member of the appellate body, and so she's someone who's really sensitized me to that issue. But I also think, you know, in the case of China, we really haven't held China to promises it made when it joined the WTO. And I understand the reason we collectively have done that is because we've all benefited a lot from the Chinese role in the global economy, and China is a market for our exports. But I think we need to be much more rigorous about holding countries accountable to commitments they made. And again, it's some of the issues we talked about earlier around protecting intellectual property and making sure that technology transfer is not happening in a way that's happening now. I mean, I think there are several elements of that. So I think there are multiple issues that we need to look at in that WTO context. Please.
Hi, I'm Jim Mayu, I'm a sophomore. So I had a question regarding the proposal for creating European industry giants, because we talked a lot about China today, and I was wondering what were your thoughts on the European decision to not let through the Siemens Alstom merger, because I know we talked about China not really playing by the rules. So do you think that the EU should probably not try to go forward with this idea of monopoly, and perhaps let this merger happen, or do you think it should stick to its economic policies and say that that's not right?
So, you know, I was in Europe last week, and obviously the decision about the merger had happened, which has an interesting outcome as well, because the European commissioner responsible for that, Vestager, has been talked about as a candidate to lead the European Commission, that she would be the nominee of the Liberal group in the European Parliament. But there's been a backlash against her personally by France and Germany because of the decision about that merger. So it's interesting, the multiple dimensions of that decision, or the ramifications of it. But what shocked me was when Peter Altmaier, the German economics minister, basically came out in support of creating industrial champions. Why is this surprising? It would not be surprising to me if a French government does this. I mean, the French traditionally have been champions of, creating, that sort of industry leader. But the Germans, and particularly the German Christian Democrats, the center-right party, have always been opposed to that kind of industrial policy. So to have Peter Altmaier, who is the Christian Democratic Minister of the Economy, come out in favor of creating industrial champions, and he went so far as to name certain companies who he thought should be protected. That was really shocking to me because, in terms of, if you believe in liberal economics, which the United States typically has, and the UK typically has, and the German CPU typically has, it was really quite striking. And actually, it's another great example of sort of the Europeans waking up to the threat from China. Because that clearly is what was behind Peter Altmaier's presentation, was that if we want to compete with China, then we need to be having things like the Alstom-Siemens merger, and we need to be backing and protecting our own companies. As someone who believes in kind of liberal economy, I don't think that's the right way to go. And it's kicked off a huge debate in Germany, actually. I mean, I don't know that that policy is going to hold in terms of the Merkel government. But it is fascinating to see how people are responding to the challenge of China. And that definitely is one very clear example in the German case. But it's not a policy that I personally would argue in favor of.
Time for like one or two more questions.
Okay, so oh gosh, before, if you had a hand up, how do we do this? All
Want to
right.
collect them all, maybe?
Okay, really short questions, and I'm giving long answers, so I can give short answers. Okay, so start here, and we'll just go to you for it. Yeah.
You mentioned that you've been in Afghanistan in 2003. You've been in State Department in 2003 when disagreement with the European allies was playing out. And America was obviously an indispensable nation since the Second World War. It did bring about democracy to both Germany and Japan, and upheld the liberal values. Did you, being there at the State Department in 2003, believe that, say, I was wondering, democracy can be just in the same way be brought about to the Arab world? And what do you think now? How have you re-examined your own views on that since?
So you had mentioned how in the future we need to consider the New West, and I'm wondering, with the EU, it seems that they're responding to the current administration's approach of seeing the EU as a challenger. So how can the EU really, or how can we reconcile the relationship afterwards between both sides of the Atlantic as the EU is now kind of looking for ways to move on without the US, creating PESCO, or finally enacting PESCO and other economic trade agreements?
Okay. And yeah.
Hi, I'm Constantine Lamazou. Thank you for your talk and for proving the strength of the Fletcher Mafia. And my question is very short. Do you think that NATO in its current structure is an appropriate organization to respond to future and emerging security threats, i.e. demographic changes and migratory flows and the opening of the Arctic route?
Sorry, was it NATO?
In its current form, is
NATO's
it
current
an appropriate structure to respond to the emerging security threats, which might not always stem from Russia?
Yeah, okay.
Hi, I'm Lucy from the Master of Arts in Transatlantic Affairs, so really creative, so very fascinating to study this topic. My question is regarding sub-state diplomacy, and to what extent do you think that also governors in state level have roles to play in trying to preserve this transatlantic relationship? I'm thinking of, for example, the role of California in the climate saying, we're staying in the Paris Agreement, and also the role of civil societies and think tanks like yours into trying to preserve that relationship that we have.
Sure, and I'll sort of start there and come back. I mean, I think the role of subnational actors is critically important, and we don't pay enough attention to it. And that's why we've been focusing on governors and mayors, because there are many issues where they play an important role. And I mean, climate is a good example of that. So in this alliance of states that are remaining committed to the Paris Climate Accord, the biggest one is California. And depending on the survey you look at, California has the 5th or 7th largest economy in the world. So everybody wants to sell cars in California, and that means emission regulations set by California matter. And they matter much more than just for the state of California. So I absolutely think that we should be looking more at some national actors. We have an urban and regional policy program at GMF. We also have a program that looks at congressional and gubernatorial actors. So yes, is NATO fit to sort of meet the challenges of the 21st century? Well, no. I mean, I think some of them it can't meet. So if you're talking about the challenge of migration, I don't actually see a role for NATO there. I think the EU has a big challenge to agree across its member states on how to enforce its external borders and how to come up with agreed policy. But an area where NATO absolutely needs to do better is cyber. And NATO's aware of the challenge, and there's a Center for Excellence in Estonia, and I'm not saying they haven't moved, but they haven't moved far enough. So, the key for NATO is remaining relevant to the challenges of your day. And cyber is such a great tool for Russia because it's cheap. I mean, you really, with very little resources, can have an outsized effect, and we have lots of evidence of that. And your question was about the EU, and how do we, I mean, you were sort of saying the EU, given that they sort of said, okay, can't rely on those Americans, we need to double down on our own capacities, or if you want to use the French word, autonomy. So I'm someone who actually is not worried about that. I think if the European Union becomes a more effective and efficient actor, that's good for the United States. Because it goes back to, I think we share the same values. I think when we look out at the world, we mostly share the same interests. So I want the EU to actually put more resources at its disposal and be more effective, because I think that's in the interest of the US. I don't see it as competitive. I mean, I see how in theory you could spin it out where one day it becomes competitive, but I think the EU being more capable is a good thing. And then to your question, which is really about democracy promotion, I mean, the thing that was so striking about the case of Iraq is, you had these binders of what to do after the war. in Iraq in terms of trying to build up government ministries and X, Y, and Z. None of that was followed. And so it felt like it was a case where, you know, we used our hard power effectively, but really didn't follow up with our soft power. And I think, you know, this is always a real challenge for policymakers anywhere, which is what's the right mix of power. And it's interesting, if you haven't read it, there's this wonderful thought-provoking book by Bob Kagan called The Jungle Grows Back. And basically, the title is explained by the fact that Bob Kagan sees the world as a Hobbesian place, right? Like basically human beings are bad and the world is evil. And he argues that the past 70 years have been singular because the US was willing to play the role of cutting the vines of the jungle back. The US was willing to use its hard and its soft power in support of this liberal international order. And he argues that the US has stopped doing it. And he wouldn't just say it stopped doing it under Donald Trump. He's very critical of Barack Obama and sort of US retrenchment. And you know, so he makes the case that you know, the US, no one else is going to step into that role. So it's really critical that you know, sort of the US refine that purpose. But you know, it's interesting. It was interesting to me reading it, having served in the Obama administration, because I don't see it as a linear evolution from Obama to Trump. You know, it seemed to me that what Barack Obama was saying is the US has maybe relied too much on its hard power. Yeah, we could go in and fight a war in Iraq and Afghanistan, but if we're honest, we haven't achieved the goals we set out for ourselves. And you know, we can't make all problems right. And so we have to be thoughtful about how we use US power and what the right mix of hard and soft power is. And this is sort of part of the reason why I think whomever comes after Trump, you're not going to be going back, because I think that feeling that Barack Obama had about an overextension of US power is real, and I think the American public feels that quite deeply. And you know, in President Trump, it's a weird mix of sort of isolationism, but also I believe I can make deals with like North Korea. It's a weird mix of things, but I think that you know, the U.S. role in the world is changing, and this is something we all have to grapple with, which is how do you use the tools at your disposal, and what's the right mix of those tools? And I don't want to understate U.S. power. I think the U.S. has tremendous power, both hard and soft, but it's thinking about how you use it judiciously to best effect. And you know, a point I want to close on for all of you is, I really hope I haven't sounded partisan in anything I've been saying. I've tried to be analytical, but I am somewhat unusual as sort of Americans who served in government go, in that I served in the Bush administration and I served in the Obama administration. And I do belong to a political party. It's irrelevant which political party that is. But I say that because for me, public service is deeply meaningful. And I think when you go to Fletcher, you're all going to do different things. Some of you are going to go into business, some of you are going to go into the nonprofit world, some of you are going to go into government. And I think it is important to not always look at foreign policy through a partisan lens and to say, well, I'm a Republican, so I'm only going to serve in a Republican administration, or I'm a Democrat, so I'm only serving in a Democratic administration. I mean, if you're going to be Secretary of State, yeah, that matters. But if you're going to be at the working level somewhere, really what the U.S. government, or whatever governments, you know, whatever countries you're from, what they need are smart, committed public servants. And I do hope that some of you will go into public service, because I think it's really rewarding, and I think that these are difficult issues. There are not easy answers to any of the things that Secretary of State Pompeo or Jim Mattis previously, you know, they're dealing with. And I think to have committed people who bring different perspectives, different life experiences into government is really important. So I just want to end on, public service matters, and let's hope for a time when U.S. foreign policy isn't so partisan. Because I do believe that there are something called U.S. interests, and they begin at the shores of this country. And I don't know if in my lifetime we ever get back to a bipartisan foreign policy consensus, but I think we would be well served by it. So anyway, thank you all. It's so nice to